The next 12 months will determine whether the United States remains the dominant global power or watches its influence fracture across two continents simultaneously. This is not speculation. This is the conclusion being reached inside defense ministries, central banks, and intelligence agencies from Washington to Beijing to Moscow. The year 2026 has emerged as the critical inflection point in a confrontation that has been building for over a decade. And the decisions made in the coming months will lock in consequences that cannot be reversed. What most analysis misses is that China and Russia are not operating on separate tracks. They are coordinating, not in the Cold War sense of ideological alignment, but in the far more dangerous sense of strategic synchronization. Both nations have identified the same window. Both have calculated that American power is stretched thinner than at any point since the end of World War II. And both are positioning to move before that window closes. The Trump administration has inherited a chessboard where every piece is already in motion. The question facing Washington is not whether to engage. Engagement is unavoidable. The question is whether American strategy can adapt fast enough to prevent two simultaneous challenges from overwhelming the system designed to handle one. To understand why 2026 matters, you need to understand what has changed in the underlying structure of global power. For 30 years following the Soviet collapse, the United States operated as the unchallenged architect of international order. American military bases spanned the globe. American financial institutions processed the majority of cross-border transactions. American technology companies dominated global communications. American currency served as the universal medium of exchange. That architecture is now being contested on every front, not through direct military confrontation, which would trigger responses Washington is prepared for, but through systematic construction of parallel systems designed to reduce dependence on American-controlled infrastructure. China's Belt and Road Initiative has now extended to 149 countries. The investments are not charity. They are strategic positioning. Ports in Pakistan, railways in Kenya, telecommunications networks across Southeast Asia. Each project creates dependency. Each dependency creates leverage. The total value of Chinese overseas development financing exceeded $1.3 trillion as of late 2025. That figure dwarfs anything the United States or its allies have offered as alternative. Russia's approach has been different, but complementary. Where China builds, Russia disrupts. The weaponization of energy supplies to Europe demonstrated that dependence on Russian resources could be converted into political leverage overnight. The invasion of Ukraine, whatever its military outcome, achieved something strategically significant. It proved that a major power could challenge the post-Cold War settlement and survive the economic response. Western sanctions against Russia were supposed to be devastating. They were described as unprecedented, and in raw dollar terms, they were. But Russia's economy did not collapse. It adapted. Trade flows redirected toward China and India. Payment systems shifted to alternatives that bypassed SWIFT. Energy exports found new buyers willing to ignore Western pressure. The lesson was not lost on Beijing. If Russia could withstand maximum economic pressure while waging a conventional war in Europe, then the threat of sanctions alone was no longer sufficient deterrence. The weapon had been fired, and the target had survived. This is the context in which 2026 becomes decisive. Both China and Russia face internal timelines that converge on the coming year. Both have strategic objectives that require action before conditions shift, and both are watching American political dynamics with calculations that extend far beyond any single administration. For China, Taiwan represents an unresolved question that Xi Jinping has repeatedly stated cannot be passed to the next generation. The Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy narrative requires eventual reunification. Every year that Taiwan operates as a de facto independent democracy is a year that narrative frays. The military buildup across the Taiwan Strait has not paused. It has accelerated. American intelligence assessments have consistently identified the 2025 to 2027 window as the period of maximum danger. The reasoning is straightforward. China's military modernization will reach critical mass within this timeframe. The People's Liberation Army Navy is now larger than the United States Navy by ship count. Chinese shipyards are producing vessels at a rate American facilities cannot match. Missile systems designed specifically to target aircraft carriers have been deployed in numbers that complicate any intervention scenario. At the same time, demographic pressures inside China are intensifying. The population is aging faster than any major economy in history. The workforce is shrinking. The window in which China possesses both the military capability and the economic resources to sustain a major operation is not infinite. It is narrowing. Russia faces its own timeline. The war in Ukraine has consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. Estimates suggest Russian forces have suffered over 300,000 casualties since the invasion began. Equipment losses have been staggering. The defense industrial base is operating at capacity and still struggling to replace what has been destroyed. Putin's calculation appears to be that outlasting Western support for Ukraine is possible if pressure can be maintained through 2026. European unity has already shown cracks. Energy prices, though lower than their 2022 peaks, remain elevated enough to strain household budgets across the continent. Political movements skeptical of continued Ukraine support have gained ground in multiple NATO member states. The American election cycle adds another variable. A new administration means policy uncertainty. It means potential shifts in commitment. It means opportunity for those watching from Moscow and Beijing to test whether rhetorical support translates into actual resources when the moment arrives. What makes this convergence particularly dangerous is the emerging coordination between Chinese and Russian strategic planning. This is not an alliance in the formal sense. Neither nation has committed to defend the other militarily, but the practical cooperation has deepened to a degree that complicates American planning significantly. Joint military exercises have become routine. Russian and Chinese naval vessels now operate together in the Pacific with increasing frequency. Intelligence sharing has expanded. Technology transfers that were once limited have accelerated, particularly in areas where Russian expertise complements Chinese industrial capacity. The economic integration is equally significant. Bilateral trade between Russia and China exceeded $240 billion in 2024. That figure has continued climbing. Russia has become dependent on Chinese imports for goods that Western sanctions have cut off. China has secured access to Russian energy at prices below global market rates. More importantly, both nations are actively constructing financial infrastructure designed to operate outside American reach. The Chinese yuan now accounts for a larger share of Russian foreign exchange reserves than the dollar. Cross-border payment systems that bypass Western-controlled networks are processing increasing transaction volumes. The groundwork for a parallel financial architecture is no longer theoretical. It is operational. The Trump administration has signaled awareness of this challenge. The rhetoric has been direct. Tariffs have been threatened. Military deployments have been announced. But the gap between rhetoric and capability remains the central question. American military forces are stretched across multiple theaters simultaneously. Commitments in the Middle East persist despite repeated announcements of drawdown. European allies are demanding increased American presence to deter Russian aggression. The Pacific requires additional naval assets to maintain credible deterrence against Chinese moves toward Taiwan. The mathematics do not favor trying to do everything at once. The United States Navy has approximately 290 deployable ships. The combined Chinese and Russian navies exceed 400. This does not mean American forces would lose a direct confrontation. Qualitative advantages remain significant, but it does mean that simultaneous crises in multiple theaters would force choices that no American administration wants to make. Taiwan or Ukraine, Pacific or Atlantic? Which ally gets priority when both are under pressure? This is the scenario that Chinese and Russian planners have studied. This is the scenario they appear to be engineering. Not a single decisive confrontation, but coordinated pressure across multiple fronts designed to force the United States into impossible trade-offs. The economic dimension adds complexity. American sanctions power depends on the dollar's centrality to global trade. That centrality is eroding, not rapidly, not catastrophically, but consistently. Central banks worldwide have been diversifying reserves away from dollar-denominated assets for over a decade. The pace accelerated after Russia's reserves were frozen in 2022. The message received by every non-aligned nation was clear. Dollar holdings could be weaponized. Assets could be seized. The security that dollar reserves once represented was conditional on political alignment with Washington. Gold purchases by central banks reached record levels in 2024. The trend has continued into 2025. China has been accumulating gold at a pace that suggests preparation for a scenario where dollar-based systems become unreliable or inaccessible. The BRICS expansion announced in 2023 brought Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia into the bloc. The significance extends beyond symbolism. These additions mean that BRICS nations now control approximately 40% of global oil production. They represent roughly 45% of the world's population. They account for over 35% of global GDP when measured in purchasing power terms. If these nations increasingly price commodities in currencies other than dollars, the structural demand that has sustained American financial advantage begins to weaken. This is not a sudden collapse. It is a gradual shift. But gradual shifts can accelerate when confidence erodes. The Trump administration faces a strategic environment where economic tools that once provided leverage are becoming less effective. Military commitments exceed available resources, and adversaries are coordinating in ways that multiply the challenges. The response options are not attractive. Confrontation risks escalation that no side can fully control. Accommodation signals weakness that invites further pressure. Attempting to split the Russia-China partnership requires offering something that one side values more than the partnership itself, and it is unclear what that something might be. Some analysts have suggested that economic pressure on China could force Beijing to distance itself from Moscow. The logic is that China's economy depends on Western markets and investment in ways that Russia's does not. Severing ties with Russia to preserve access to American and European consumers would be the rational choice. This analysis underestimates how fundamentally Beijing's strategic calculations have shifted. The Chinese leadership has concluded that dependency on Western markets is itself a vulnerability to be reduced, not a relationship to be preserved at any cost. The dual circulation strategy announced in 2020 explicitly prioritizes domestic consumption and production over export dependence. The technology decoupling that began under the previous administration has accelerated. Chinese companies are investing massively in semiconductor manufacturing capacity. Success is not guaranteed. The technical challenges are immense, but the direction of effort is clear. China is preparing for a future where access to American technology cannot be assumed. The military balance continues shifting in ways that favor Chinese and Russian planning timelines. Every year that passes without direct confrontation is a year in which the correlation of forces moves further from where it stood at the end of American unipolar dominance. This does not mean war is inevitable. Deterrence can still function, but deterrence requires credibility. Credibility requires capabilities matched to commitments, and the current gap between American commitments and available resources is the vulnerability that adversaries have identified. 2026 emerges as the deadline for multiple overlapping reasons. Chinese military modernization reaches maturity. Russian endurance in Ukraine approaches limits that require either escalation or settlement. American political attention shifts toward the next election cycle. European economic pressures peak as energy transition costs compound with defense spending demands. The convergence is not accidental. Strategic planners in Beijing and Moscow can read calendars. They understand the rhythms of democratic politics. They know when attention will be focused elsewhere. They know when coalition unity is hardest to maintain. What should be understood is that the next 12 months will not simply determine the outcome of current crises. They will determine the structure of international order for the coming decades. Whether the United States retains the capacity to shape global events or becomes one power among several in a fragmented system depends on decisions that cannot be deferred. The administration in Washington faces choices that previous generations avoided through overwhelming advantage. That advantage has narrowed. The margin for error has shrunk. And the adversaries watching have concluded that the moment to test American resolve is approaching. None of this is predetermined. History remains contingent. Decisions matter. Leadership matters. But the structural forces pushing toward confrontation in 2026 are now visible to anyone willing to look clearly at the evidence. The question is whether the response will match the scale of the challenge, whether the investments required will be made, whether the alliances necessary can be sustained, whether the strategic coherence that previous eras maintained can be recovered in time. 2026 is not simply a date on a calendar. It is the point at which trends that have been building for years either resolve into a new equilibrium or spiral into consequences that will reshape the lives of billions. The countdown has begun. The pieces are in motion, and the window for changing trajectory is measured in months, not years. What comes next depends on choices being made right now in capitals around the world. But the framework within which those choices operate has already been set. China and Russia have identified the timeline. They have coordinated their positioning. They are prepared to move. The only remaining question is whether Washington understands that the deadline is real.